Okay, so the next topic that I want us to discuss is group and aggregate functions. Now we already discussed aggregate functions, but we didn't specify that these were. But let's begin with group. What is group? You will see this statement that we are going to use, which is group by. Group by, basically what it does in SQL, it basically groups multiple rows by unique sets, and you will see in the next slide what does it mean. And aggregate functions, the difference between group by and aggregate functions is that aggregate functions will take multiple columns and do some computation on them and merge them into one single value. And for example, we already discussed these functions, and this is the count, mean, max, average. All these functions, what basically they are doing is taking a set number of columns, a set number of values, it does some computation on them, and it displays one single value. Some functions don't do a computation. For example, mean doesn't do a computation, it doesn't calculate something, but it gives us one single value. And this is the difference between group by and aggregate functions. Now let's talk about group by, what group by means. So for example, I will go here in this next slide, and we have here a table. And this is part of our table payment. And we have the payment ID, which is the primary key for our table. We have customer ID, which is the foreign key for our table customer, staff ID, and amount and payment date, and so on. Now notice that these 6 rows, when we are looking at customer ID, it has only 3 unique customers. It has the customer ID 341, 342, and 343. So even there are 6 rows, there are 3 unique customers. Now, when we are running a group by statement, let's say we want to group all these rows by customer ID. So what Postgres is going to do, or what any SQL command is going, any SQL database is going to do, is we'll look in this column customer ID. We'll look on these values, and will give us the unique number of values. So in our case, is 3. So for example, let's say we want to group by customer ID. You will have 3 rows. 341, 342, 343. Now the question is, what will happen with the other values? If we take it logically, it will need to be displayed something like this. So 341 will need to have 2 rows, and 343 will not have 2 rows, and 343 will need to have 2 rows. For example, if we look here, 341 has the payment ID 1 and 2. So it has grouped them by this, but these columns have not been grouped by because they are distinct from the customer ID. 1, 2, staff ID 1, 2, amount, payment date, and so on. Now this won't work in Postgres or in other database. So for example, let's try to fire a query. I am here in my PG admin. I just select start from payment to see. We see here we have our payment table. You can go ahead and do also. And now the command is something like this: group by, and now I need to specify the column name. So the column name, I will say group by customer ID. Now notice here that I'm selecting all the rows, all row, so all columns, all 6 of them. Now notice what is the error. So the error says column payment ID must appear in the group by clause or be used in an aggregate function. So what Postgres is trying to tell me is something like this: hey, you told me to group by customer ID, and now the first thing that it evaluates is the first column, the payment ID, and it can't put multiple columns in one column, multiple values in one single value. So what's the catch here? The catch here is that group by needs to be used with either with an aggregate function, or we have to specify every column in our query. So for example, if I put here just the customer ID, I will get all the unique customers in our table. So for example, if I go back, let me go back and select count. Let's see how many rows do we have in our table. we have 459 6 rows. These are all the rows in our payment table. And if we do payment ID from payment, okay, group by payment ID. No, not by payment ID, by customer ID, and we should put here customer ID. We'll have 599 rows, so only 599 unique customer ID, and this doesn't help us very much. But if we want to display also these columns, we need to either include them in our group by statement. And what this will do, for example, if I say here payment ID, you will see I have this error because the payment ID, now what we're trying to do, we'll try to do like something like this. Let me delete this. We'll try to do something like this. So I have to include this column in the group by statement. Now what this command will do, this will work, but now it will retrieve me all the unique combination of customer ID and payment ID. And because payment ID is unique, I will have, let me fire again, you see here I will have the same number of rows that I have in my table, because these are, every row is unique in the whole table. So this doesn't help us much. But group by is usually, let me just undo, group by, that's why I talked about aggregate functions in the last videos, because group by is usually run with aggregate functions. And what aggregate functions will do, we will see in the next video how we can achieve this.